Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Pearlie Brewer and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Ed MacFarlane. Ed's background includes 24 years as a health and safety officer at SSNB and 12 years with the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, DTI. Ed is currently retired and works part-time teaching supervisor safety courses. Welcome, Ed.
Good morning.
On today's podcast, we want to focus on the legal responsibility of supervisors in New Brunswick. It's a topic that's received a lot of coverage in the media, especially with the Bill C-45 case that's currently ongoing. But in general, I think there's a lack of knowledge of what the exact responsibility of supervisors are. So that's really what we want to get into today on our podcast. But before we do get into our discussion, Ed, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your time at WorkSafe NB and DTI?
Okay, Pearlie. Well, I went to work for the Occupational Health and Safety Commission, which is the now WorkSafe NB, back in December of 1986 after I had been a woods foreman for 5.5 years for a large company, and there was an opportunity to come up I saw, so I applied, get in, and started doing forestry safety and sawmills first. And at that time, the Occupational Health and Safety Commission was a small, robust organization that was solely focused on the compliance of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And the Act had only come into place in 1983, so really going into a lot of workplaces, they knew little or nothing about the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the rights, the responsibilities of people. So a lot of our jobs was actually education, educating the workforce, employers. You know, you go into a workplace and they hadn't even heard of us in a lot of cases. Like, what are you doing here? What are you going to do in my workplace? So at that time, there was a forestry sector, mining, general safety, and a good group of education officers who were going around trying to educate the province on the Act and what people were supposed to do in the workplace to protect individuals. So did that for a while, and then I moved into general safety later on, which is more all industry sectors. So stayed with WorkSafe until early 2011, and there was an opportunity at that time with the Department of Transportation as a health and safety consultant. So I decided to take that opportunity to get out and use my skill sets rather than going in and inspecting and writing orders and investigating incidents and fatalities, to try to use it to help their incident record. So I started with DOT, which is DTI now, in 2011, and stayed on with them as the manager of wellness, health, and safety until December of 2022 when I retired. So I had a great career. Working for WorkSafe was an awesome opportunity. They looked after their staff as far as I was concerned. A lot of educational opportunities in health and safety. Sat on a CSA committee to see how CSA standards were built, which was a real eye-opener. And then working with DTI was awesome. A range of hazards within DTI. So really able to apply the skill sets I'd learned while working for WorkSafe to try to bring down the accident record and make DTI safer for their employees.
So, Ed, let's discuss supervisory responsibilities as outlined in the New Brunswick Occupational Health and Safety Act. So let's start with, under the Act, who is considered a supervisor?
Well, that's changed recently, Pearlie, because previously there really wasn't any definition of a supervisor. They were just an extension of an employer in the Act. But now there is a definition, and a supervisor is now defined in the Act as a person who is authorized by an employer to supervise or direct the work of the employer's employees. So I think the key word there is that an employer has to authorize someone to be a supervisor.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, if an employer is going to appoint someone, and let's face it, a lot of this often happens that, hey, Ed, you're one of our better workers, and someone just retired or left, so I need a supervisor. I need to put someone in charge. You really get production done, let's put you in charge. And in a lot of cases, that's all it was. I was going to get an increase in pay. I knew how to do the work, but not necessarily always safely. So in this case, now a supervisor, they're saying that the employer is authorizing someone to be a supervisor, but then it goes on down to say what that supervisor has to do and actually what an employer has to do to ensure the supervisor is set up for success.
Now, everywhere you go, people have different titles. Does that make a difference? Some workplaces will call them lead hands. Some will call them supervisors, whatever. So does that make a difference?
Not as far as I can see in the Act, because a supervisor is someone who oversees the work of other employees. They direct the work. So they're actually telling people what to do, what their daily activities are. They're organizing the work and directing employees.
Now, in the Act itself, they list the legal responsibilities of the employer, supervisor, and the employees, as well as other workplace parties. In layman's language, Ed, what does the OH&S Act say about the responsibilities of the employer in general? Now, we'll get in a moment to what the Act says about the employer's responsibility in the hiring and training of supervisors. But let's leave that for a moment. What does the Act say relative to the responsibilities of the employer in general?
Well, in layman's terms, Pearlie, the employer has the full responsibility to ensure the health and safety of their employees, no matter if their employees are in a building, if they're out on a road job, if they're on a construction site, no matter where they are, what they're doing. The employer has the ultimate responsibility to ensure their health and safety, and they have to use all reasonable steps to ensure that.
Now, back in 2019, changes were made to the Act relative to the supervisor, and one of the sections that was added was around the area of the responsibilities that the employer has when it comes to either hiring or promoting someone into a position of supervisor. What are those responsibilities?
Well, when an employer is going to hire or appoint someone as a supervisor, they really have to, first of all, select someone who has the training and experience of the work that they're going to be assigned to. That supervisor really has to know all of the hazards related to the type of work that their employees are going to be doing. They may not be the best widget maker themselves, but they have to know the aspects of the work, the tools and equipment that are going to be used, any chemicals or anything that's going to be used in the workplace, the processes to do the work. So, excuse me, they have to ensure the safe use, inspection, and maintenance of all tools and equipment. So not only they have to know, but then they have to make sure the employees know how to properly inspect that tool before use, how to use the tool in a safe manner. If it's broken, where to put it, what to do with it, the chemicals and substances, how to use them safely. They have to know how to instruct employees in how to use personal protective equipment that might be used. They have to look at the hazards of the workplace. Can they eliminate them? Can they substitute one product for another? Can they use engineering principles to try to guard employees from hazards? They have to know the emergency procedures. Who's required for first aid? What first aid requirements are there in the workplace? Are there any ergonomic concerns in the workplace? So, are they having soft tissue injuries? If they do, if they are, how can they prevent those? So as you see, a supervisor has to be what we term competent in all aspects of their work. They should also have good interpersonal skills. Supervisors directing their crew. They need to be able to talk to their crew, direct them, coach them, so that the crew understands what the requirements are of them and how to do the work in a safe manner. They're going to be coaching and mentoring. They need to be doing safety talks with them. And they also have to be given the opportunity and the ability to discipline where necessary. So, the law says that you have to ensure that employees comply with the Act and regulations. Well, a supervisor has to ensure that compliance. So if the company has policies and procedures in place and they're not being followed, the employer or the supervisor, with the employer's direction, has to be able to correct those issues and problems.
Now, you use the term competent. And if you go into the Act, it says that when it comes to an employer either promoting or hiring someone into a position as a supervisor, they have to ensure that, as you pointed out, that they're competent to be doing that job. How does that happen? How do they know whether or not that person's competent?
Well, the whole thing of competency is that they are knowledgeable or experienced in the type of work, and that they can do the work in a safe manner. So the term competent is actually defined in OHS legislation, and what it says is that for someone to be competent, they have to be qualified because of such factors as knowledge, training, and experience to do the assigned work in a manner that will ensure the health and safety of persons. I mean, that's a lot, and a lot of people get that part of being qualified through training to do the job. Maybe they're a carpenter or a millwright or a scaffolder. And let's face it, a lot of people today in the workforce, they go to trade school and get their training in that trade. That a lot of times makes them qualified. Then part B of that is knowledgeable about the provisions of the Act and regulations that apply to the assigned work. That I find, Pearlie, is one of the ones where it's more difficult to prove that someone is competent. People generally have an understanding of maybe safe operating procedures, safe work procedures, which are taken from the Act and regulations, but they really haven't looked at the Act and regulations themselves to see how they can be applied, or if they're understanding them properly. And then part C of that is knowledgeable about the potential or actual danger to health and safety connected with the assigned work. Well, that again is, if you're a scaffolder, what are the potential or actual dangers to health and safety? Well, let's face it, falls is a big one. Collapsing scaffolds, scaffolds that are not built to regulation could be a hazard. The planking may not be put in properly or set in place so it's not going to move. There's all kinds of hazards and dangers when you're erecting or building scaffolds, and they have to know about those hazards.
Now, you appoint as an employer Joe, who's been making widgets for 25 years. What do they need as far as training when you appoint them as a supervisor? Well, can you just say, look, Joe, you're a great widget maker, go for it?
Yeah, well, I think unfortunately, Pearlie, that's what has been done over many years. But I think we can also say that it is better in the workforce today, that a lot of supervisors who are being appointed are more knowledgeable, have better skill sets to go in and do the work. But yes, the Act now does state what new supervisor should be instructed, not should be, has to be instructed in. So they have to be instructed in the Act or regulations that apply to the type of work they're doing. So, Pearlie, I tell supervisors, you don't have to be able to repeat it verbatim. You have to understand where it is, where to find it, and in general, what it speaks to for the type of work you're doing. They have to understand the safety policy of their employer. So that shouldn't be too hard. It's usually a one-pager. They have to understand and be instructed in the health and safety program of the place of employment. Well, most good workplaces today have a health and safety program in place. So they should have a good orientation in that program. They have to be aware and instructed in any health and safety procedures that apply to the work they're doing for the use, handling, storage, disposal of any tool or equipment or products. So any procedures they have set up in the workplace that apply to that supervisor is overseeing, they've got to be pretty familiar with. They have to be familiar with what personal protective equipment is required in the course of work, and be able to instruct an employee in how to use that equipment, care for it, maintain it in the course of their work. And then there's this other catch one, Pearlie, that says they have to be aware of any other matters that are necessary to ensure the health and safety of employees who work under the supervisor's supervision and direction. So that's kind of a catch-all. So that could be what emergency procedures are in place. What's in place if there's all of a sudden the power goes out in the workplace? What if there's a flood? And what if there's a piece of machinery or tool that suddenly breaks? How do they go about the lockout procedure, shutting it down safely? So that more or less is what the supervisor has to be instructed in.
So what kind of time frame are we looking at for a new supervisor as far as training goes on those kind of topics? Are we talking about a day, a couple of days? What would we be looking at? As if a supervisor comes to you and says, well, that's quite a bit. What should I allocate as far as timing for my staff to get that knowledge?
That's a good question. The Act doesn't state any kind of time frame as to when a supervisor has to be instructed by the employer in their duties and responsibilities, as we just covered. So where it doesn't cover it, that tells me it has to be immediate. So when someone's appointed as a supervisor, they have to be knowledgeable in this information. Obviously, Pearlie, as you and I know, instant knowledge is not possible. So I guess what I would suggest is that if a supervisor is going to be appointed, they should start that process hopefully before. They should know the business. They should already know the program, the health and safety program and policy. They should know the work. So a lot of that is knowledge they already have. So getting the rest of the information, the Act and regulations and the hazard processes, that should be relatively easy. That could be done, I would think, within a month or so, Pearlie, of being assigned. There's courses like the one that Safety Services had. There's online courses. There's all kinds of things available to an employer and a supervisor in order to get that information.
Now, you mentioned one thing just a moment ago that I think we want to clarify is that you said, well, some things maybe they could pick up over time. Now, the only concern with allowing people and saying to people, well, you can pick up some of these things over time is that, what can happen between the time they're appointed and that time maybe a month down the road. So some people would suggest that, as much as you can, certainly you should ensure that supervisors have this knowledge as soon after they're appointed as possible. Because sometimes you'll hear employers say, well, look, we'll get around to training Fred, in due course kind of thing, maybe a month, maybe 2 months down the road. What's the caution to there?
Well, definitely. I guess I didn't understand that I had said that, but really, a supervisor, as I said, should be knowledgeable in most things before they're appointed, unless they're hired from outside the company. If they're hired from outside, obviously they're starting from scratch on the processes in that organization, possibly. But yes, it has to be done relatively soon. And like I said, probably within a month, because they're now supervising. Unless there's other supervisors and other people in that plant or factory or process that are highly skilled that can help them out for that period of time, they really have to be up to snuff on their health and safety responsibilities, hazard control, etc., basically almost immediately, Pearlie. Leaving things for a period of time, if that's what I said, leaves the chance that there's something serious could happen.
Now, once a supervisor is appointed, once they've received the training that you just talked about, what are their responsibilities under the Act?
Well, that too is now defined better in the Act, Pearlie. And under Section 9, actually, of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So we're talking about supervisor in this case, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the responsibilities under the Act for the supervisor are that they very similar to what the responsibilities are to an employer, because they are an extension of the employer in the workplace. So they're to take every reasonable precaution to ensure the health and safety of the employees who work under their supervision and direction. They have to comply with Act and regulations and any order that a health and safety officer may make in the workplace. They have to ensure that the employees under their direction comply with the Act and regulations and any order made. That, again, is one of those hard ones. How do employees comply with something they don't know? So they really have to make sure the employees understand the Act and regulations as well. They have to cooperate with the Health and Safety Committee, if there's a committee in the workplace, or a health and safety rep. They have to ensure that they acquaint employees with the hazards in the workplace. Well, they themselves have to be aware of those hazards before they can acquaint an employee. And that includes the tools and equipment that are used in the workplace, the handling and storage and disposal of any tool, equipment, chemical or physical agent, They have to provide the information that is necessary to ensure the health and safety of the employees under their direction. Well, that again is all of the safe operating procedures they have in place, emergency procedures, lockout procedures for equipment and tools, how to do their work in a safe manner that protects themselves. And then they have to instruct employees in any other manner.
Due diligence is a term that's often used, and supervisors are told that they have to be duly diligent and they have to do all those things that you just described that will in fact show, should something happen, that they were in fact duly diligent and they did what they should have been doing. Talk about this term due diligence for a moment.
Well, the due diligence part is that supervisor, that employer, is doing everything that is reasonably practicable to ensure that their employees are health and safety, are working safely and protected from harms that might harm their health in the workplace. So all reasonable steps are taken. They're ensuring they're instructed. They're ensuring that employees are trained in the PPE, the processes. So they're taking steps that they feel, according to the law, are going to protect them. And due diligence is something partly that keeps moving forward. Really, it's the courts often that determine what is duly diligent. What are other companies who are proactive doing? What have the courts determined through court cases are things that companies should be doing to protect their employees?
So we talked about the employer's responsibilities. We've talked about the supervisor's responsibilities. What about the employee? What are their legal responsibilities under the Act?
Well, as you can see from what we discussed, the majority of the responsibility in the workplace lies with the employer, obviously, and then the supervisor as an extension of the employer. But there are responsibilities on the employee, and an employee's responsibilities are pretty simple. They have to comply with the Act and regulations in any order made in accordance with it. So that means they have to understand it. They have to conduct themselves to ensure their own health and safety and that of other persons that work around them in the place of employment. So they can't do horseplay. They can't be working with tools and equipment they shouldn't be working with. They can't jury rig tools or equipment to work with it that could be dangerous. They have to report to the employer or supervisor the existence of any hazard to which the employee is aware. That is a difficult one for supervisors, trying to get employees to report all hazards. Because let's face it, a lot of employees just don't feel sometimes that it's a real hazard or a threat. They have to wear or use such protective equipment as is required by regulation, and obviously through the health and safety program at the workplace. So, do they have to wear respirators? If so, do they have to be fit tested, clean shaven, safety glasses, hard hats, gloves, etc. They have to consult and cooperate with the Joint Health and Safety Committee where one's been established, or a health and safety rep. So if there's a health and safety committee, they may be out talking to employees, doing workplace inspections or doing an incident investigation. Well, the employee is obligated to work with that committee and cooperate with them. And they have to cooperate with any person responsible for the Act and regulations, like a health and safety officer. So a lot less requirements for an employee, but yet there are legal obligations.
Now, if you were talking one-on-one to a new supervisor and they said, yes, I was trained according to what you previously covered, given a good 2-day course in supervisor responsibilities, the Act, the regs, due diligence, and all those sorts of things. Now, tell me on a very practical level, on a day-to-day basis, what should I make sure I'm doing to keep my people safe?
Well, Pearlie, I think one of the most important things for supervisors is that they conduct a morning briefing with their crew. This allows the supervisor to assess their crew is all there with them. They can visually see, hey, are you here? Are you tired? Are you fatigued? Are you ready for work? So, and they're conducting a morning briefing. Just what are we going to be doing today? Are we all ready to do our work? Are we set up for it? Do we have the training, the tools, equipment to do our work in a safe manner? Do regular walkthroughs of their work site. A supervisor should always be assessing their work sites for hazards. There's always new things that can come around. There's environmental conditions that can change if you're outside. How their employees are working. Are they following their safe work procedures and working in a safe manner? And if they aren't, obviously make corrections. They should be making sure the employees are following their approved standard operating procedures and safe work practices and not deviating from those. Supervisor should make sure their employees are conducting pre-use inspections of tools, equipment, or processes that they're going to be following. Supervisor has to keep good notes on all of this, Pearlie. That's really important as well. Just note that I had a safety talk with the crew this morning. Here's what we talked about. Here's who was present. I went through the workplace, observed a couple of hazards that were corrected at the time. Maybe a hazard can't be. We're going to correct it immediately after. We controlled it for now. Just make sure they're keeping good notes for their due diligence. And another thing a supervisor has to do is just be a good listener. Make sure that when employees are bringing hazards to them or concerns, as is required by the Act, that they listen. They don't just say, oh, that's really nothing, we'll look at it later. Acknowledge things that are brought forward by employees and make sure that those are addressed, and you give feedback to employees about the things they bring forward to you.
Now, Ed, you've been around a long time when working in health and safety. We won't necessarily repeat how many years, but I'd say probably just about as long as anyone I've met. You've seen lots and lots of supervisors as in your time at WorkSafe NB. You've seen a lot of supervisors in action in your time at DTI. What advice would you give a new supervisor? Maybe some do's and don'ts, things you've seen that you like, things you've seen that you say you want to remind people, make sure you don't do that, and so on.
Well, that list could be pretty long, but I guess a few things are doing regular safety talks with their crew is really important. That's one of the best ways to cover pieces of the acts and regulations that are pertinent to the workplace. You know, they don't have to go through it verbatim, Pearlie, but they can go through, here's what we're talking about, lockout, or personal protective equipment, or handling heavy materials. They can cover things from their own health and safety program, their own standard operating procedures. Are a really great way to do that through their safety talks. They should make sure there's a solid orientation for their employees. That's usually the employer's responsibility to ensure people are orientated, but then they're going to get to that specific site, and that's where the supervisors going to come in to make sure that they're covering the hazards of their specific area for new employees or employees that are coming to them. They want to make sure that they have safe operating practices or safe job procedures, whichever you want to call them, for their work area and the tasks that are being covered. They want to make sure that the employees themselves are doing a hazard assessment. That hazard assessment needs to be done before every task. Make sure that they're looking at all the hazards and putting controls in to make sure that they're covering the hazards. Provide positive feedback to their employees for working safely. Employees often hear the negative. Let's make sure they hear the positive reinforcement. One other thing I'd recommend in the do side is that the supervisor downloads a copy of the WorkSafe app, the NBOHS guide. This is relatively new from WorkSafe, Pearlie, and it gives an employer right on their phone legislation in layman's terms on what they need to do to ensure health and safety of employees. Now, on the don't side, I guess a few things are, don't always assume that your crews are working safely. Just because you've given them instruction, just because they know the SOPs, they've had good orientation, don't just assume they're always going to follow it. Employees are human. They make mistakes. You need to follow up regularly to make sure your employees are working in a safe manner. Don't always assume that employees understand what they've been taught. Yes, they may have sat in a classroom and you may have gone over your SOPs or safe operating procedures and safe job procedures, but people take in a certain amount and then they kind of go numb, sometimes early in training. So you have to follow up to make sure that they understood it and can apply it. And don't ever say, okay, just this one time. Yeah, we can work around that, we can protect ourselves, and we'll fix it next time. Once you do that once, you've ruined a lot of the proactive work that you've done in the past. Make sure that if there's a hazard, you stop it, you correct it, and then you carry on. It's someone's life that you're looking after. And I guess that's primarily what the things that I would look at, Pearlie.
Look, Ed, thank you very much for joining us today. You certainly have brought a wealth of experience to our podcast as it relates to supervision. I'd like to thank Ed again for being here today. And as always, folks, we appreciate your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Any ideas you have for future speakers on our podcast or topics, certainly get a hold of us and send us an email, pearliebrewer@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your ideas. Thank you very much for listening to today's podcast. Stay safe. See you next week.